The woman at the counter didn't look up right away. She was filling out a form, pressing the pen down harder than she needed to. And Brendan Okafor noticed that first, the tension in her hand, the rigid line of her shoulders, before he noticed anything else. Then she looked up, and the world went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the post office. Her name was Leigh Castillo. He had not said that name out loud in 11 years. She was wearing a paramedic uniform, the dark navy kind with the yellow stripe down the sleeve, and her hair was shorter than he remembered, pulled back tight, a few gray threads catching the fluorescent light. Her face had changed the way all faces change in a decade. Sharpened at the jaw, softened around the eyes. But the eyes themselves were the same, dark and careful and already reading him before he had said a single word. "Brendan," she said. Not a question, just the name, placed down between them like something fragile. He had driven 40 minutes from the farm outside Stettler to pick up a registered package, feed supplements, nothing dramatic. And now he was standing in a post office in Camrose, Alberta, holding a number slip he'd already forgotten to tear off, looking at a woman he had loved completely and lost in a way that still didn't make sense to him all these years later. "Hey," he said, which was, he thought afterward, a spectacular failure of language. Brendan Clarence Okafor was 44 years old. He had a farm, a 12-year-old daughter named Rue, 2 dogs of questionable obedience, and a reputation in Stettler for being the kind of man who showed up when things needed to get done. Fencing after a storm, driving someone's grandmother to a specialist in Red Deer, dropping off food when a neighbor's wife had surgery. People relied on him. He was steady in the way that some people become steady after the ground has shifted under them enough times. He had not always been steady. He had been, at 31, the kind of man who believed love was enough, that if you felt it clearly and completely, that was the thing, that was the whole point of it. He had learned, slowly and at some cost, that love being real and love being enough were 2 very different propositions. He had met Leigh Castillo on a Thursday afternoon at a barbecue at his friend Daryl's place in Leduc. She had arrived late, carrying a 6-pack and wearing muddy boots she hadn't bothered to change, and she had walked into the backyard like she already knew everyone there, which she did not. She'd laughed at something a stranger said before she even introduced herself. Brendan had been standing by the grill, spatula in hand, and he'd watched her for a full minute before he moved. They were together for 3 years after that. 3 years was long enough to know the weight of someone's sleep beside you, the particular way they took bad news, the specific kind of silence they needed after a hard shift. Leigh was a paramedic even then, working out of Edmonton, and she carried her job the way certain people carry weight. Not on the surface where anyone could see it, but deep, in the chest, in the place where breathing came from. She had ended things in November, on a Sunday, standing in the kitchen of the apartment they'd been sharing for 8 months. She had not cried. She had said she was sorry. She had said she needed something she couldn't name yet, and she thought staying would only make that worse. She had said she loved him, and Brendan had believed her, and that had somehow made it worse than if he hadn't. He had moved out by the following weekend. He hadn't seen her since. 2 years later, he'd married someone else, Denise, who was kind and funny and real, and who died of a brain aneurysm when Rue was 4 years old. The doctors said it had been quick, that she would not have felt it coming. Brendan had stood in a hospital corridor at 6 in the morning with his daughter asleep on a chair behind him, and he had understood. In the flat and certain way you understand things when your body stops arguing with them, that his life was now entirely rearranged. He had come to the farm after that. His uncle had left it to him, and it had seemed at the time like the only thing that made a clear kind of sense. Land that needed tending, work that required his hands, a place far enough from Edmonton that Rue could grow up without the shadow of a city that held only grief for both of them. He had built a life, It was quieter than he'd imagined his life would be, and smaller in some ways and fuller in others. Rue had her friends and her 4-H project, and a particular hatred of mornings that she came by honestly. The dogs. Pepper and a shepherd mix named Soot had claimed every soft surface in the farmhouse with the confidence of animals who knew they were not going to be argued with. It was a good life. He believed that most days. He believed it all the way up until he was standing in a Camrose post office looking at Leigh Castillo. "You look well," she said. "You too." He cleared his throat. "You're stationed out here now?" "Wetaskiwin." She set down the pen. "I transferred about 2 years ago. Needed a change." "From Edmonton?" "From a lot of things." She said it without drama, just as information, the way she had always delivered difficult things, plainly, without softening them into something more palatable. He had always respected that about her, and occasionally resented it in equal measure. The postal worker at the window called a number and 2 people ahead of Brendan shuffled forward. There were 4 people in the queue and the space was not large, and somehow the small size of the room made the conversation feel more exposed than it should have. "Are you picking something up?" she asked. "Yeah, feed order." She almost smiled. Still farming, he paused. "You still on the trucks?" "I'm a supervisor now, but I still do shifts when they're short." "Of course you do." That was when she did smile, small, quick, a little rueful. "Some things don't change." He didn't say anything to that. He was aware of his hands, suddenly, and what to do with them, which was a strange thing to become aware of in a post office at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning. "I heard you got married," Leigh said. "Someone told me, I don't remember who. And that she passed away." "Yeah, I'm sorry, Brendan. That's an enormous thing to lose." It was. She looked at him steadily. "How long ago?" 8 years. "And you're raising your daughter on your own?" "Rue. Yeah, she's 12 now." He said it and something in him relaxed fractionally, the way it often did when he mentioned Rue, like her name was a handhold. "She's something else. She sounds like it." Leigh paused. "What's she like?" He thought about it honestly. "She argues like a lawyer. She's teaching herself to play guitar, and she only does it at 6 in the morning, which is a choice. She cried for 20 minutes last spring because a calf she'd been bottle feeding got sold, and then she went straight back out to do her chores." He stopped. "She doesn't quit. She never quits." Leigh's expression did something he couldn't quite name. "She sounds like you. She's better than me. Most of them are." They ended up outside on the sidewalk afterward in the October cold, because the queue had cleared and neither of them had offered a reason to leave yet. The sky was the particular flat gray of an Alberta October, the kind that wasn't threatening, just permanent, settled over the prairies like a second ceiling. Leigh had her keys in her hand, but wasn't moving toward her car. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. Are you angry at me?" He looked at the parking lot. A truck was pulling in too fast, overcorrecting, settling badly into a space 2 down from his. He watched it for a second longer than necessary. "No," he said. "I was. For a while. I'm not anymore." "I thought about calling," Leigh said. "After I heard about Denise. A few times. I didn't know if it would help or make things worse." "Probably both," he said honestly. She laughed, short, surprised. "Yeah, probably." She turned her keys over in her hand. "I thought about you more than I said to people. After it ended. I want you to know that." Brendan looked at her. He had imagined this conversation in various forms over the years. Not obsessively, not in a way that interfered with his actual life, but the way you imagine things you half expect will never happen. The version in his head had always been cleaner, easier to navigate. The real version was standing on a sidewalk in Camrose in the cold, and it was complicated in all the ways real things were complicated. "Why did you go?" he asked. "I mean, you said what you said, but I never really understood it." She was quiet for a moment. "I was scared," she said finally. "Not of you, of it, of how much of it there was." She looked at him directly. "You were all in, Brendan. You were completely all in, from the start. And I didn't know how to be that. I didn't know if I ever would. And I was more afraid of failing you slowly than I was of leaving fast. He let that settle. It was, he thought, the most honest thing she'd ever said to him about it, which meant it had taken her 11 years to get there, which meant something too, though he wasn't sure what. It hurt, he said. For a long time. I know. I'm sorry. I know you are. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. I'm not saying it to wound you. You asked. I did ask. A cold gust moved down the street and she tucked her chin briefly and then straightened. She had always hated admitting that she was cold. He remembered that suddenly and with startling clarity. Standing outside a hockey rink in Edmonton 5 months into knowing her, watching her refuse to acknowledge the temperature, and laughing at her about it until she laughed too. I'm not in a place where I'm looking for anything, he said carefully. I want to say that. Not because I'm trying to hurt you. Just because I think it's important to be clear. She nodded. I'm not asking for anything, Brendan. I wanted you to know that it meant something to me too. Back then, it wasn't nothing. I know it wasn't. And I'm sorry it took me until a post office in Camfros to say it to your face. He almost smiled. Could have been worse. Could have been the DMV. She laughed again, and this time it was the real one, the one he remembered, the one that came from somewhere unguarded and unpracticed. He had loved that laugh when he first heard it at Daryl's barbecue. He still thought it was a good laugh. He drove back to the farm in the early afternoon, the registered package in the back seat, the heater running. The highway through Ponoka County was straight and mostly empty. The fields on either side gone brown and dry under the October sky. The kind of landscape that some people found bleak and Brendan had come to find steadying. The scale of it, the honesty of it, the way it made no promises about what season was coming. He thought about Leigh's face when he'd mentioned Rue. He thought about the way she'd said it wasn't nothing. He turned off at the county road and followed it west for 6 kilometers, the gravel loud under the tires, and pulled through the gate. Pepper came sprinting from the barn before he'd even stopped the truck, which was Pepper's permanent policy regardless of how long Brendan had been gone. He sat in the truck for a moment after he turned off the engine. Leigh wasn't asking to come back. He understood that. And he didn't have the shape of that anymore. The shape that would know what to do with her showing up again, with all the history that came attached to her. He had a daughter who argued like a lawyer and cried over calves. He had a farm that needed him. He had a life he had made from scratch, from the ground up, from the worst point he'd ever been at, and it was built solidly, and it was his, and it was real. He thought of what Leigh had said. You were completely all in from the start. He still was, just differently. All in on Rue. All in on this land. All in on the particular small dignity of showing up to things even when they were hard, because that was the only way he knew how to be in the world. The grief for Denise lived in him like weather, sometimes distant, sometimes immediate, never entirely gone. The grief for what he and Leigh had been was older and quieter and more like the ache you got in an old injury in cold months. Present, familiar, not the thing that defined you, but still occasionally reminding you it was there. He got out of the truck. Pepper circled his legs with urgent, unconditional enthusiasm. Soot appeared in the barn doorway, yawned extravagantly, and went back inside. He picked up the package from the back seat and carried it toward the barn. Rue came home from school at 4:15 on the bus, dropped her bag by the door the way she always did, despite being told approximately 800 times not to, and found Brendan in the kitchen making soup from the stock he'd put up last week. Good day, he asked. Average. She opened the fridge and stared into it with the particular blankness of someone not actually looking for anything. There's nothing to eat? There's soup in 40 minutes? That's not nothing to eat time? That's future food. She closed the fridge. Can I have crackers? Yes. She got the crackers from the cupboard and sat at the kitchen table. And for a few minutes there was just the sound of the soup on the stove and Rue eating crackers with the methodical steadiness of someone restoring their energy after a long day of being 12. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Keisha's mom said her aunt's farm is doing agritourism now. Like people come and pay to do farm stuff. I've heard of that. We could do that. We could." She looked at him. "You're not saying no. I'm not saying anything yet." That's basically yes. She ate another cracker. "I have ideas." "I figured you did." She almost smiled. She had Denise's eyes and his mother's stubbornness and some third thing that was entirely her own. A quality he couldn't name, except that it showed up when things were hard and made her stand straighter instead of smaller. He thought about what Leigh had said. "She sounds like you, maybe." He hoped so. He hoped some of the better parts, anyway. "How was your day?" Rue asked, with the tone of someone performing the social contract. "Interesting," he said. "I ran into someone I used to know." "Who?" "Someone from a long time ago, before you were born." She considered this. Good interesting or bad interesting? Just interesting. He stirred the soup. One of those things you don't plan for, and then there it is. Rue nodded slowly, with the seriousness of someone who was beginning to understand that life contained categories of experience that couldn't be tidied into good or bad. She was at the age where she was starting to see the edges of that. The complicated grief of losing a calf she'd fed from a bottle, the unfairness of a friend moving away, the way you could miss something and also know it was the right ending. "Did you talk?" she asked. "Yeah, for a while." Was it okay? He thought about the sidewalk, the cold, the way Leigh had said it wasn't nothing. He thought about the drive home, the flat gray highway, the fields that asked nothing of him and gave him room to think. "Yeah," he said. "It was okay." She seemed satisfied with that. She ate the last cracker and brushed the crumbs carefully into her hand and deposited them in the sink, which was something she did when she was in a good mood, and he noticed it and was grateful for it. The soup was almost ready. Outside, the light was going the way it went fast in October, the sky shifting from gray to the specific deep blue that came just before dark, and the barn light was on, a warm square in the yard. He ladled soup into 2 bowls and set one in front of Rue and sat across from her. She picked up her spoon and said, without looking up, "I think we should definitely do the agritourism thing. I think we should definitely have this conversation when you're not also trying to eat soup. I can multitask, you can try." She looked up at him then, briefly, and smiled. The real one, the one that was entirely her own, the one that had come out of nowhere and remade everything about his life in the room of a hospital he never wanted to think about and couldn't entirely stop thinking about. The one that was still here, across from him, eating soup and making plans. He picked up his spoon. The farm was quiet. The dogs were somewhere soft. The fields beyond the window were going dark the way they always did, steady and patient and without drama. This was what he had. This was what he'd built. And on most days like this one, when the light was going and the soup was hot and Rue was making plans across from him, it was more than enough. If you've ever run into someone from your past and felt the ground shift a little, you know exactly what Brendan felt in that post office. Sometimes those moments are the universe asking you a question. And sometimes the most honest, most courageous thing you can do is already know your answer. If this story meant something to you today, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you're watching from somewhere out there, wherever you are, thank you for being here.